Thank you all for joining today. And thank you for joining me and Simone to talk about cyber insurance and how it really works in today's society and the challenges we face. Before we really get into the presentation itself, just two small comments. If you have any questions, it would be great if you could drop those into the Q&A box that should be as part of your Zoom bar. And we'll answer those questions at the end of the session. We'll try to get through as many as we can, given the available time. If you registered yourself, you will also get an email with the link to the recording of this presentation in about 3-4 business days or something like that. So with all that, let's get going. Something like me, I worked in security for about 20 years. I've chopped and changed organizations, large and small, and I've been very much focused on management, governance, strategy, and architecture. And at Pitcher Partners, we have a security team that assists our clients with understanding their security risk and managing that risk on an ongoing basis and the challenges that come with that. And of course, I have many clients that ask me about cyber insurance, which really triggered the idea for this invite, but also the incident response side that come with all that.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. I'm Simone Herbert-Lowe. I'm a legal practitioner and director of Law and Cyber. I've been a lawyer for nearly 30 years now, and for 20 years, I worked in professional responsibility. I worked for the insurer for the legal profession in New South Wales for around 20 years, where I handled around 2,000 professional indemnity notifications over that time. And in my last few years in that, before starting Law and Cyber, in my last few years in that role, I was really focused on cyber risk. Insurance companies, not surprisingly, are always looking on the horizon for claims trends, because claims trends are always the biggest cost for an insurance company. So I was privileged to work with colleagues who've been affected by cybercrime and email fraud. It really created a very strong impression for me that cyber risk is a very different kind of risk to, you know, what professionals have needed to sort of think about in the past. It's not connected to your abilities in whatever profession it is. It's something really completely different. And as part of a previous role, I helped manage the introduction of a group cyber policy for more than 6,000 law firms. And since starting my business, I've acted for businesses impacted by cyber events and email fraud. And I've also created, I do a lot of risk management education as well, and have authored and presented some online courses. So having worked in the insurance industry for a while, it's been very interesting to see cyber insurance develop. It's really only been around for 20 or 30 years. It's very different to other classes of insurance, which have been around for much longer. And yet at the same time, businesses there's been such a change such a transformation in the way we do business over, you know, especially the last 10 or 20 years. Information being stored electronically, a really amplified risk of harm in many ways if incorrect information is out there or there are data breaches, for example. And of course, the ability for people to commit funds transfer frauds against people, either through impersonating someone using electronic communications like email, which we all love. It's so convenient, but it isn't as secure as we would all like, or through actual computer intrusion or infiltration of online accounts. So business insurance needs to adapt to that changing marketplace as well. So yeah, thank you very much for having me here today, Eric.
Thanks so much, man. Sounds like you have a very interesting life. So look, today we really talk about what we might call cyber resilience. And to be honest, I already touched on the fact that when I talk to my clients, it's a lot about understanding their risk and managing that risk on an ongoing basis, and all the actions that come with that. which would really fit in the risk reduction box, which is really about how you minimize the risk of an incident happening at your organization, and if an incident happens, minimizing the impact of that. Which is one way you can, of course, manage your risk and want to manage your risk. But the alternative is risk transfer. You can transfer part of your risk to another organization, which is really what insurance is about. You transfer the risk to someone else, you pay a premium for that, and if the incident occurs, the insurance hopefully kicks in. And then if there is an incident, there is a recovery bit, and this is really where your insurance firm could potentially help. And I thought it would be important to point out that we'll work through a number of scenarios and events that happened or that we've seen with the organizations that we worked with. And we'll discuss how insurance, cyber insurance, but also other insurances respond to those events. We could have a whole separate webinar on how you could implement many controls to reduce the risk and prevent that incident from happening entirely. But that is not really the key focus. The key focus today is really about the different events and threats that happen on a daily basis, unfortunately, and how the insurances respond to that. So a few of the events that we want to cover today are very common ones. There is obviously other ways organizations can be impacted as well, but these are the ones we see the most. We see impersonation fraud, where people really try to pretend to be someone else, managers or other organizations, and try to convince people to do something. We see phishing, where you receive an email or basically people attempt you to click on a link that might install something. We obviously see ransomware. I think we all read about it on a daily basis in the healthcare industry in Australia recently again, or the oil pipeline in the United States that I'm sure we all heard about. And then there is just human error, people making unintentional mistakes in the organization, which then triggers a security incident, which in all fairness happens more often than probably the other ones combined. But usually don't make it to the press because organizations don't really like those things to come out.
In terms of the kind of losses that a cyber event can be quite different to what we've seen in the past with different kind of business losses, and that has created it can create a bit of confusion in terms of which policy you might want to make a claim on. For example, it's interesting that I think many businesses would regard cyber risk now as being in one of their top 5 business risks, and yet it isn't necessarily covered in typical business pack insurance that you might buy in a small business, for example, or even a medium-sized business. So the kind of losses that you could have if you have email fraud or cyber events, it really depend on the actual incident itself, but the kind of things you would want to be thinking about are incident response costs. So if you have a ransomware event and your system's locked up, who are you going to call, right? Do you have somebody in-house, or do you want to go to an external specialist, a forensic specialist? The one thing that I've come to learn, I suppose, is that there are specialties in IT as much as anything else, and the people who are dealing with ransomware day in and day out can have keys to unlock ransomware. They share, they share those keys amongst themselves and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of advantages that can be obtained by dealing with those kind of specialists, and you can get access to that with a cyber insurance policy. Also, business interruption loss. Some of the more traditional types of policies like property and so on might require there to be a property loss before you get a business, you're eligible for business interruption. But many of the old style property policies assume that you're talking about tangible property. Property in cyberspace is intangible, it's data and so on. So cyber insurance policies can provide business interruption loss for if your business is shut down for a while, or if you have as a result of an event, or alternatively, if incur additional costs as a result of a cyber event. Data and system recovery costs. Quite often what can happen is that data is lost altogether, or it's got to be, systems have to be rebuilt. Many people have heard about the NotPetya malware that went around the world in 2017, also the WannaCry malware, and systems had to be completely rebuilt, and they were massive costs. One law firm in particular had hundreds of, 100,000 hours of IT or something like that had to be done to recreate a global network after that. So these are the kind of things that can be covered. Now, funds transfer frauds is something, particularly people who are professional trustees have got, funds transfer frauds are a worry for everybody. They can be an additional worry for people who manage other people's money, of course. So we'll look at some examples around which kind of policies might respond to that. And, going back to what Eric said about cyber extortion. Now, there was that incident that shut down fuel supplies in the east coast of America last week because of a ransomware attack on an energy provider there. According to the media, it was reported that they ended up paying something like a $5 million ransom to regain access to their system. They needed, as I understand it, the ransomware didn't necessarily shut down the whole system, but for safety reasons, they then themselves had to then shut it down. So cyber policies can actually cover cyber extortion payments like that, provided that they're done with the insurer's consent. And there's also the expenses in terms of, the forensic IT and all of that as well. And then lastly, another really important area is regulatory breaches. So once you have a business with revenue or turnover of more than $3 million a year, you are subject to the Privacy Act in Australia. And if you have a data breach, that means that there's a serious risk of personal harm to people. There's an obligation to notify people, and also the Privacy Commissioner. And you might find there's other sort of regulatory issues as well. So cyber insurance can cover you for your own business losses in this category. And the ones that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide here are known as sort of first-party losses, so your own business's losses. But quite often there can be an exposure to third-party claims. So that's when someone else wants to bring a claim against you. Damages for funds transfer, in relation to funds transfer frauds, maybe even professional negligence or breach of trust if you're a trustee or you manage people's money. Breach of confidence, for example. These are things that can be covered, but it's really important to be aware of how they interact with other policies, and also be aware that cyber insurance often has different sublimits. So a business might have, say, $1 million worth of cover, but they might have $250,000 worth of cover only in relation to what we call social engineering, which we'll talk about in a moment, or maybe $50,000 worth of cover for a direct financial loss. So these are the kind of other losses you might have. Privacy and network liability and media liability. So if you're an IT provider, IT services provider, you may you would want to consider coverage in case you had any kind of event that interrupted other people's networks. And also media liability, if somebody puts something on social media that's defamatory, for example, or on your website. So these are the kind of losses that you can see under cyber policies. So in many ways, the theme for my sections today is that insurance is a jigsaw puzzle, and that's because one policy won't necessarily protect you from all risks. We have a very diverse range of organisations and people who've tuned in today who will have very different kind of risk profiles depending on what your business does, and also risk tolerances as well. Depending on what it is your business does, you might want to be thinking about a combination of different policies. So here on the screen here, we've got PII, so that's professional indemnity insurance. If you For example, some of the people watching are from law firms or accounting practices. That might be relevant for you. Cyber policy to cover the kind of losses we've just discussed there. Crime policy can also cover funds transfer frauds where the money that is stolen belongs to your business or maybe is taken from someone inside your business. But again, there are other policies as well, depending on what kind of industry you're in. So property, people have property policies, as I mentioned as well, and also general liability policies that might be relevant. And just a word there, just before going on to that, is that we've had these traditional policies like property damage policies that have been around for a long time. And then people, if they didn't specifically exclude cyber, they could actually include cyber events because they weren't specifically excluded. And I know that a couple of years ago, Lloyd's of London brought in a new sort of protocol that any insurer selling these kind of policies had to be very clear whether it was covered or not, so that people could understand, you know, whether a cyber event was covered under their property policy or not. If they just lost all their data and it was stored electronically, but the property said it was for physical, tangible property, then you wouldn't be covered, and so on. So it's a really quite complex area, and really encourage people to talk to a specialist broker to be for guidance about what kind of coverage you already have and what additional coverage you might want to take out. Professional indemnity policies generally respond to the risks associated with giving professional services. Now, if you, as I mentioned before, if you are a professional trustee or you are in a profession that involves managing funds in trust, like conveyancing and lawyers and so on, you may find that ordinarily what would happen is if there was a breach of trust or negligence action against you by a client, the first place you would look to for policy response in that scenario would be your PI policy. At the same time, that isn't going to cover you for your own business losses, and that's where a crime policy or a cyber policy can apply. Also, even management liability policies can apply to cover crimes where money is stolen that belongs to you. But where it belongs to a client, it's more likely to be a PI policy that would respond. On the other hand, if you're a dentist or a doctor, you're not going to be managing people's money, and that is probably not going to be covered under your policy. So everybody, again, should get advice in relation to that. So, Eric.
It sounds like a very complicated puzzle, to be honest.
It is, yeah.
They're very much depending on your personal circumstances as well.
Yeah.
To my earlier point, we do have a number of scenarios that we would work through and see how the different insurances respond in these particular cases. And if we look at the first case, I guess we're really looking at impersonation fraud. And impersonation frauds is something I unfortunately deal with pretty much on a daily basis. And it is a bit of a broad term. What really happens is that a criminal impersonates someone, and that could be you towards another party, where they pretend to be you and reach out and then ask the other party to do something. And the other party could be a colleague, or it could be a third party, or the other way around. They're trying to approach you pretending to be someone, or maybe pretending to be your client. And what they're really trying to do in the end is get some information or money. I must admit that in my daily cases, I generally deal with requests for money, and it's a low effort event on the criminal side. It's generally not that hard to try to pretend to be someone. If they do some research about you, and if you end up being someone they deem important, they might actually take a bit more effort and actually start searching through for example, your social media, so they can really sort of understand who you are, what your interests are, which then allows them to frame their message in a way that is more like you. or more like the other party. So it comes more across more, I guess, recognizable. But it really all falls under the social engineering banner. It usually happens through email. It could potentially happen through phone, but email is really the common attack vector these days. So as an example, we have Kathy here, who was conveyancing for a client and had done that already several times. And the email, she got an email from the client who basically asked her to send a payment towards a new bank account. It's something we deal with on a daily basis. And then in her case, someone at the conveyancing office actually changed the bank details and the transferred funds. And they all thought it was all fine, of course, until a few days in, and the client phoned and said, look, something really went wrong. I never got the message, or I never got the money. And where did it go? And of course, they did some research and said, we transferred it to you. And the client said, I never asked. I never seen the money. I never asked for a change in bank details. And that's, of course, where they discover that the fraud actually happened, which is unfortunately a very common scenario still. So how did they do it in this particular case? Well, first of all, they sent an email address from an email that looked very similar. So in this particular case, for example, they used jake@corporateaustralia.com. And now the second email address looks almost identical, but if you really pay attention, you will see that the I in Australia has been changed to an L. This is a very common case. They just registered a domain name that looks pretty much identical. Most people wouldn't see the difference. And if they know Jake a little bit, they send a message in his wording with something like him, and it just gets processed. Of course, the money that was transferred to the incorrect bank account was removed from that bank account immediately, which is very common. They just use these bank accounts and clear them out within hours, if not minutes, and the money is often gone. If the money is transferred within Australia, you're sometimes still in luck. The banks can see where the money went and try to get it back for you. But if it is gone outside Australia, it gets a lot harder. And even within Australia, there's no guarantee, because from the bank's perspective, you approved bank transfer to a bank account. So it's really on you, to be honest. In this particular case, it should be pointed out, there was really no intrusion in any computers. They just sent an email that looked authentic from an email address that looked authentic, but wasn't really.
Yeah, so this is this kind of social engineering case. If you're managing money for somebody else, unfortunately, someone in Kathy's situation would be potentially on the receiving end of a claim for negligence and breach of trust. So as I mentioned a little earlier, a claim for damages by a client, the first place you're going to look is your PI policy rather than a cyber policy if you are like a professional trustee. Now, in saying that, people need to check their own policies. People will be from listening today from a range of different kind of job roles and professions. But it is the sort of thing that would typically be covered under many professional indemnity policies. And the next example is a little different in the sense that on the next slide, some of you may have seen these headlines late last year about a hedge fund that went up because it was one of the directors received a fake Zoom invite. So this was an example of phishing, which we'll talk about some more in a moment. But the hackers were able to infiltrate the computer, the email account of one of the directors of a business called Levitas Capital. And it was reported in the newspaper that the director, logged into the account early in the morning because he was expecting a $16 million payment to come in from a particular superannuation fund, and he, much to his horror, saw a transaction for a couple of $1 million had gone out that he knew nothing about. And then more money just kept going, and of course they tried to freeze it and so on. But the reason we've included this example here is to show that that issue about being a trustee is a real concern for many people. I think as part of looking at this article, there was a mention in some of these articles that something like $300 million was stolen in this way last year in Australia. And so you have a situation where you might be dealing with platforms that are in themselves are secure with some of these transactions, but the actual email communications that are going back and forth can be the area of exposure. So what's happened is that hackers can be in someone's system for a while and watch transactions, learn how to impersonate somebody, and then send an email to a trustee. And the trustee, in this case, reportedly phoned, but the director wasn't available at that time, and the funds transfer went ahead. So definitely, in terms of insurance, if you're in this situation, you want to be you want to make sure you know what you're covered for if you're managing other people's money, but just be aware as well that people can sometimes have rights against other parties in this situation. So it was reported that the hedge fund in this case had brought legal proceedings against the trustee or a legal claim as well.
Which is very interesting because, as you already mentioned, in this case, sometimes systems get hacked, but in many cases, they are not hacked at all, or maybe it's just infiltration in the mailbox at best. And then it really becomes about influencing people and convincing people to do things, and not trying to technically hack into environments or into systems or organizations, which is proving increasingly difficult. And it really proves that, or it really shows that, to be honest, people are often the weakest link in that sense. And that's why there's so much focus on security awareness in organizations, because you can have all the systems and all the controls in the world, but if people still take emails, etc., like this for granted, then these incidents will just continue to happen.
That's right. And sometimes these can be, some of the biggest frauds you hear about. It's actually all, it's basically what used to be called confidence tricks, right? But it's just done using electronic methods. So there was a really large fraud involving a major Italian company that, from memory was something like $20 or $30 million, and they impersonated the CEO to a subsidiary in India and tricked them out of $20 million. There's a very famous case involving an aircraft parts manufacturer where it was all just scam emails, no computer intrusion again, it was just social engineering that they were able to trick the chief financial officer into transferring, I think it was like maybe 30, 40 million euros, something like that, just through those kind of methods. So that's why there is such an emphasis on education, of course. And the next example is another common one. It's known as CEO fraud, and I mean that with no disrespect to any CEOs who might be listening. But what it is when somebody impersonates a manager. Often it's a CFO or whatever, or a partner of a firm or someone like that in a managerial role, and they request a transfer of funds, and it's often done urgently, and an employee may action that quickly and without question unless training has been provided. So in terms of the policy response for that sort of event, many cyber insurance policies will have, Eric, just on the next slide, a lot of cyber insurance policies will contain coverage for that kind of event. But as I mentioned, they can have what are called sublimits, which means you might have $1 million worth of cover for everything from a cyber event, but you will only have up to, say, $250,000 for a payment like that. But sometimes the liability in these sometimes these scenarios aren't always really clear cut as well. There can be a few people who get tricked, and then there's a question about who actually was responsible. But yeah, but do be aware that these kind of coverage for this kind of event can be available under a cyber insurance policy, but also maybe under a crime policy if it includes electronic crime, or even a management liability policy as well. So this slide is really just reinforcing that in a case like that, if it's the cyber policy or a crime policy. There are different policies, but that can provide cover for electronic crime. But if you do have a crime policy, make sure it covers electronic crime or social engineering as well.
So the next scenario is not quite the same as the previous one. The previous one was more about impersonation and trying to convince people to do things. This is more about phishing. And phishing are these emails that I think we all receive all the time, where they try to get some information from you or try to get you to click on a link. And of course, they would like to try to be a trusted source. That is not always possible. And then through phishing, they might redirect you to a website that looks, for example, legitimate. You might receive an email from your bank that says, something happened to your account. Please go online and fix this and this in your profile. And it contains the link to the online banking website. You click on the link, you go to the website. It looks really, really legitimate. You type in your username and password. In a bad setup, you type in your username and password and nothing happens, or you get an error message and you might try again. In the really good setups, it even redirects you to the actual bank website and still logs you in, so you didn't even notice that it was the incorrect one. Or it might ask you to enter credit card details or some information on colleagues or clients. But what they're really trying to do is capture some information from you. And of course, depending on the information they capture, they can use that. For example, if they have your username and password for your online banking environment, I would be a bit worried about my bank account. If they get my credit card, I guess I at least have the confidence that there is a limit on it, even though it's probably a lot higher than I would like to. And in the other cases, the information they glean from you might be used to basically set up a more advanced attack that follows on that to that potential individual. So if we look at Rob's story, he was told by 2 clients that they had paid money into his trust account, but it was based on fake emails. And they never received the money. And of course, they started saying, that something went wrong, it's your mistake, and I would like to get my money back. And they filed a claim against that for a lot of money, over $200,000. There were multiple emails from clients saying, why do you ask me for money? And that was a bit weird, given he was the trustee. So it seemed like he had reached out to many organizations and clients about asking for money, which is not something he would usually do. And when an expert came in, they found that the trust office, that someone in the trust office, an employee, had clicked that link in the email, which allowed the hacker access to computers, and then had used that access to send emails to all these different clients. This happens on a very regular basis. Unfortunately, hackers are sometimes, well, most of the times, smart enough to delete whatever they have sent. So it becomes a bit more complicated than just looking at your sent mailbox. You might have to dig into some logs in the various servers to see where the emails went. And unfortunately, I regularly deal with organizations where there might not be many logs to begin with, which leaves you in a situation that you really have no idea where the emails went to and who has been impacted or contacted at all which means that all clients that you deal with are potentially affected.
Yeah, so looking at that case, so we do have an actual infiltration of an online account. So that is a cyber event within the meaning of a cyber, typically within the meaning of a cyber insurance policy. But we can see that there's different kinds of damage here that Rob and his business have sustained. So firstly, if clients receive fake emails from you and they rely on it and you've never sort of warned them about a risk or whatever, there is unfortunately the possibility they'll bring a negligence claim against you because they've actually got something from your mailbox, right? It's not an impersonation scenario. Well, it is, but it has come through your mailbox. So in that situation, a client would often consider bringing a claim. So again, we're looking at that potentially being a professional indemnity policy if you're a trustee. On the other hand, Rob's in a situation where he's trying to work out what's happened. He's got to get expert in to assist him. If he's got a cyber insurance policy, when he sees that it looks like something's gone wrong, there's usually a 1-800 number that you can ring and those people will help you. They can work out really quickly, they're specialists in this and they can work out very quickly what has happened and give you advice about that. If you need to get that kind of expert advice, it can be very expensive if you're arranging for it after an event as opposed to like having it as part of an insurance policy. So that would be ordinarily covered under a cyber policy. And then if he has to consider notifying clients, unfortunately, if many of his clients have received emails from the people from the person who's infiltrated his email trying to commit identity fraud, it's obvious that this is something his clients need to be concerned about because it's not one of those theoretical things where nobody's tried to do anybody any harm. They've actually committed fraud already, and why would they not commit that against other people as well if they've got access to their information? So he would need to be thinking about what his fiduciary obligations are to his clients. You'd need to be thinking about, is this a reportable incident under the privacy legislation? What are my legal obligations in this situation? All of that would typically be covered under a cyber policy as well. So another area that is really valuable under cyber insurance is to get that sort of advice about your regulatory obligations in that situation. So again, in this situation, the insurance coverage is a bit different to the last one. So we've got a claim for damages potentially by a client that might be covered under a PII policy, but the forensic IT support and advice about privacy breaches would be under the cyber policy if he's got one.
Then ransomware. Look, ransomware, it probably doesn't need much explanation at all these days. It's a malware that gets installed, which then encrypts or locks up computers. And then they basically say that they will help you unlock the computers if you pay them a certain ransom, usually through Bitcoin. That was really the first step. That's how it started a few years ago. Unfortunately, the hackers tried to, I guess, incentivize people to pay the ransom. So initially, they just did this, and that worked for a while. And then people thought, you know what, we'll make sure we get good backups, and we no longer really need them. So as a result, the hackers didn't just start encrypting the files; they also downloaded a pretty big part of your files, or if not all. And then they would say, look, we will not just help you decrypt it if you pay. If you don't pay, we will also publish your information on the internet, which makes it a whole lot more sensitive, of course, and creates that privacy breach that we just referred to. And to really, I guess over the last year or so, they leveled it up again with another step. Nowadays, they do not just threaten to publish your information. In certain cases, they might go through your information, figure out who your clients and direct contacts and contractors are, and just reach out to these parties directly to tell you that you have been hacked and you lost their information. And so they're really trying to raise the bar and incentivize organizations to pay the ransom.
Yeah. I was just going to say on that topic, Eric, there's been quite a lot of debate lately about whether paying a ransom should be criminalized because, you know, just to starve the business model in a way, because many businesses, I mean, we talked about the pipeline, of course. Channel 9 had a ransomware incident, although reportedly there wasn't a ransom, but it was actually ransomware. I know of other businesses in all sorts of industries as well. And it's a real dilemma because, yes, it makes sense to say if it becomes illegal to pay a ransom, then you shut down the business model. But I'm personally familiar with cases where somebody's had a ransomware event and it's another company that suffered the devastating loss as a result. And people, they're kind of, these are very difficult situations that are ongoing for a very long time, trying to remediate the damage. So to say that to pay a ransom should be criminal is, you know, it's also punishing the victim in a way. So it's a really difficult area that governments are grappling with at the moment.
Very much so. Yeah. You can chat with these organizations generally around the level of ransom you need to pay, the amount of ransom you need to pay. Is sometimes quite possible to negotiate quite hard. But these people are not stupid. I worked with very small organizations that got impacted and had 3 computers that were impacted by ransomware and were asked to pay $20,000. And these people just turned around and said, look, we're not even a company. We're just a small family. We have no money. Can we pay $500? And they got away with $1,000 because that is small fry for these people. But if you're a large organization and you have 10,000 computers that are impacted, then these hackers are very aware that you're not a small company, you're not a small family either. You have a decent organization, you have your decent IT environment. They say that, for example, reestablishing a server would take you 30 minutes, an hour a server, and you have to pay someone at $50 an hour. So they can do the maths and then just price their ransom in a way that it's sort of incentivizes you to pay the ransom anyway, because even if you reestablish the service, you don't have your data yet. So data has a price on itself. It is very much a challenge, and whether you should or should not pay is indeed the balance between supporting criminals, but on the other hand, keeping your business going.
Yeah, and if you've got obligations to other people as well, like some are really disturbing, you know, the trend with publishing information as well, like particularly in the healthcare industry, for example, you know, people are, they've had ransomware attacks on, I think it was Eastern Health in Melbourne
Yes.
last year. You know, if people are providing healthcare to people, you know, if a system goes down, there was a case in Germany where a lady died as a result of a ransomware attack on a hospital, and the hackers kind of came out and said, oh, we're not going to do that anymore. And you kind of go, well, it never occurred to you that somebody might get hurt if you did this, really.
The party behind the fuel line, DarkSide, also said that they never really intended to have a major economical impact, which is right. Just, I guess, on this scenario, keeping time in mind, if we look at Alex, who has a small accounting practice and his computers has been all locked up, and of course he's unable to access anything. Even his backups are encrypted, and I unfortunately come across this regularly. I have worked with organizations that do their backups to, for example, a portable hard drive or a separate server that might even be in a separate building, and they just synchronize it overnight. But these ransomware then just encrypts it as well. So you basically, in this particular case, Alex basically has nothing left. And he can choose, does he pay Or does he just not pay, but of course suffer the consequences, and not just him, but his clients as well?
That's right. So in this case, if you've got a cyber insurance policy, that would typically respond to the incident response costs of, getting the technical advice about whether or not it can be unlocked, whether or not you can rebuild from backups or not. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this ransomware has keys that can unlock it. So, there are times when the incident responders can actually just really unlock it using that sort of key to that malicious software that's known to unlock it. Cyber policy will typically cover business interruption losses as well. So let's say it takes you a week or two to rebuild your system. As a result, then if you can substantiate, for example, a loss of revenue during that time, then you can claim business interruption losses as well. Data and system recovery costs. And you can also potentially claim a cyber extortion payment, but you would certainly want to get the insurer's consent to that as well. Certainly insurers don't want to promote this business model, and they would much rather repay to rebuild a system than pay a hacker. But if it's going to be $50,000 to pay a hacker or $1 million to rebuild a system, you can imagine that what the commercial reality of that might be for an insurance company. So if, but not all, because of the issues concerning the growth in ransomware, which has increased 300% in America, they were saying last year, there is talk about some insurers declining to pay for that in future, or alternatively making it a co-arrangement, for example, that both the insured company and the insurer contributes. And in France has announced it's going to be illegal to pay ransom. So I think, this whole area is evolving, and so cyber insurance is something that's also evolving. It's not a set and forget issue. If you buy cyber insurance policy this year, I'd still encourage you to look at the wording next year, because you might find it's a bit different. Yeah.
And the one thing that is generally not covered, but also very difficult to quantify, is of course reputational damage.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think this is our last case.
Yeah, so this was this case study is based on a leading entertainment law firm in America that acted for lots of celebrity clients very famous music people and actors and so on, and they had a ransomware attack. The hackers said they had access to clients' files, and they demanded a ransom of $25 million, I think it was initially. And then the law firm said, we don't negotiate with terrorists, we're not going to pay you. And so then they started publishing private information about certain celebrities, including their contact details, non-disclosure agreements and things like that on the internet, and then reportedly started selling off the files to the highest bidder on the dark web. And by this time, the ransom had gone up to $42 million as well. So again, that's a case of extortion there. So I know we do want to leave some time for questions, but like an interesting, what's interesting in this area is that concept of silent cyber that I talked about before, how some policies that aren't necessarily cyber policies, but will potentially cover it. So maybe some property policies, professional indemnity policy, if you're covered for a funds transfer fraud and it doesn't exclude cyber, then that would be covered. But one area that's sort of come up for discussion a bit is act of war, because a lot of insurance policies will have an exclusion for act of war. It's very, very normal for an insurance policy to have that. And with the NotPetya event, with that virus that went around the world in 2017, I think it was, that started with malicious software that was sent from Russia to an IT service company in the Ukraine, and it spread from there automatically and indiscriminately around the world. And at that time, that was around the time that the airliner was shot down over Ukraine as well. And a lot of people said, well, there's really an undisclosed war going on between Russia and Ukraine. And is this cyber incident really an act of war or not? And of course, when you hear about the Prime Minister and government organisations talking about how warfare is done now, cyber warfare is a really big part. Is a really big part of that. So that's an interesting area. There was a lot of media comment about saying, well, what's the point of having a cyber policy if it isn't going to cover an act of war and cyber war? But what many people didn't realise was that the policy that was actually being debated in that particular case wasn't a cyber policy. It was a property policy where there was some coverage for electronic property, sort of intangible property like data and things like that. So there was a lot of bad press for cyber insurance policies that the cyber industry wasn't very happy about because it wasn't actually a cyber policy anyhow.
And are you referring to the Mondelez case?
Yeah, that's right.
So
yeah.
Mondelez was the organization that asked the insurance company for about $100 million. And initially the insurance company, Zurich Insurance, said that that claim was valid. And only after some extra investigation, they said it was an act of war and they were not going to pay out anything. And that's why they're now in court. And I remember that vividly.
Yeah, but so it wasn't actually a cyber insurance policy. And I was looking at a cyber policy just yesterday that's here for sale in Australia. And it was very clear that if your loss of data is a result of an act of war, you would still be covered under that cyber policy. So, so that was a little bit of a red herring in some ways. Yeah. So the kind of things to consider when applying for cyber insurance is every business, every industry has different risk exposures, as we said. What are the risks you're most concerned about? Is it disclosure of information? Is it theft of information? Is it funds transfer frauds? Is it machinery being shut down, factories being shut down? This is the sort of stuff you should be discussing with your broker and deciding what kind of insurance to get. What is already covered under your other insurance as well? If you've got coverage under one policy already, you don't want to pay for it twice, right? And what risk management measures do you have in place? This is something that insurers are increasingly want to know about. Is insurance companies they deal in risk. They're trying to assess what your risk is. Do you educate your staff? What kind of protections do you have on your system? Do you have multi-factor authentication on your email? Things like that. These are things that they will want to take into account in deciding whether they're going to insure you and how much they will insure you for. And also be aware that insurance contracts are, there is an obligation on both parties of utmost good faith and duties of disclosure. So if you want to be covered under that policy, you will be asked to give information about risks, and that needs to be answered honestly if you want to then be covered for a risk that emerges later. So, Eric, I know we've got a few slides there, I guess, just to wrap up, that it can be a jigsaw puzzle. Talk to your broker about it, depending on what the risks in your particular business are. The key ones we've talked about already, as you can see there. And then I suppose just to conclude, almost like circle back to where we started with the next slide, is that, insurance is an important part of a cyber resilience strategy, but it's never going to be your only part of your resilience strategy. An insurance company is going to want to know what preventative measures that you do have in place. And they're not keen to pick up bad risks either. So you want to have the right technology and people and processes in place as well.
Well, that's very much so. As this slide highlights, look, your resilience shouldn't come down to just an insurance, even if it's not clear which one in particular. It's really about making sure that you minimize your risk, which makes it also more appealing for all these insurance firms to actually insure you. And then, of course, being ready for incidents and considering the insurances you have as part of that response to incidents, and to an extent, maybe transfer the risk you have.
Yeah.
To that point, and keeping time in mind, I guess, let me have a quick look at the few questions that came in, quite a few actually. Okay. So one of the questions came in, do I need cyber insurance if my IT provider is covered by their insurance?
Yes, is my answer to that. Because an insurance policy only covers that particular business, right? I mean, sure, if you're worried about something going wrong with your IT and you've outsourced it to somebody, well, how do you know that they've kept their insurance up? How do you know how much insurance they have, and so on? It's much harder to sue somebody else and then bring a claim under their insurance policy than to have your own policy. Okay, so I know of cases where people have been dissuaded from buying it because they believe their IT provider has it, but that doesn't necessarily protect you from your direct losses. It protects them. It might protect them from a legal action by you, but it doesn't mean that you can just put in a claim under their policy.
Yeah, no, that would make total sense. You have your own risk, and using their services is part of your risk.
That's right. Yeah.
That doesn't cover your risk, your personal risk entirely. Someone says that they applied for insurance and they received a confusing and long questionnaire with with lots of terminology. Yeah, I must admit that we're pretty good at that in cyber and IT. And how can insurance firms expect us to answer these questions correctly? That is a very fair question. As Simone already pointed out, insurance companies try to assess the risk that is associated with providing insurance to you. They use that to decide whether they want to insure you at all, and maybe to decide what the premium should be. And they use questionnaires from that, which is pretty common. The challenge I sometimes see, and I also see with organizations I work with, is that these insurance firms are generally relatively large. They have large teams that deal with this risk. They are EPRA regulated, and EPRA is quite on top of this. But as a result, these insurance firms create questionnaires which are then sent out to medium-sized firms. And it might, for example, be 160 questions where they probably only understand about 20 or 30 and think the rest doesn't even apply to them. And the challenge there really is that trying to answer these questions 100% correct is hard. I would recommend to either get some professional support with that, because if you answer these questions incorrect and you do file a claim later, then that can be used against you. They will say you didn't do proper disclosure, and as a result, you are no longer covered. The alternative is to try to have a conversation with the insurance firm, get some support from them to answer these questions correctly, or maybe at least try to paint the picture of who you really are. And maybe 160 questions is a bit much in your particular case. But I would say that it's, I would highly recommend not to just say yes to everything, or try to answer the right thing, even if you're not sure it's actually true, because that can, and I've unfortunately seen being used against you when you file for claims. Another great question is it critical that all policies are with one underwriter to eliminate the risk of the underwriter saying it's not covered under them, but under another?
No, I don't think so. I think, but look, I suppose, again, if you're a big client of a company, sometimes you get a little bit of the, the silver service, I suppose. But I'd still be asking your broker to be looking at just making sure you've got all the coverages that you want. I mean, they might be aligned, but they might might not be. So I wouldn't think there's a general hard and fast rule to that.
Okay.
And there's some specialist cyber insurers as well that don't actually offer necessarily offer other products, but offer really excellent cyber cover.
Okay. So it's not mandatory to have one, but you just need to make sure you've got everything covered.
Yeah.
Given the time, I'll answer one last question because we've run over by 1 minute. We already referred to a number of attacks, and the question is whether we have seen insurance companies reduce premiums if companies have implemented certain technologies to mitigate risks against certain attacks. And it refers to an example around DMARC, but there's a whole range of potential technologies. I must admit, I found it hard to see whether the premiums are reduced. I have helped quite a few organizations filling in these questionnaires and then seeing the responses they get. And I do see that there is an impact. If you are an organization that takes your security seriously, if you have some plans, if you do some reporting around that on a periodic basis against a security standard, and you can prove that with all the evidence, then the premiums that I've seen from insurance companies are generally lower than organizations that have nothing to show for, I guess, because and that is just a trend I've seen if you take into consideration the staff count. So if you're a very big organization, but you're trying to do all the right things, insurance companies, in my experience, take that into account. To what extent is always a bit hard to quantify. I didn't have discussions where I would say, if I implement this control, how much does my premium go down? But I do have the feeling that that is certainly considered. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope it was valuable to you. And thank you so much, Simone, for this webinar and sharing all your wonderful insights.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Eric. And it's been very interesting. Love to be part of today. And thanks for Pitcher Partners for having me here today.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone.